And that is this idea of giving us certainty in an uncertain world. And we talk about the idea that God is eternal. And along with that, what does that mean? Well, does that mean that God changes with time? You know, it's amazing how many people think that God has changed with time. God has evolved over time. That somehow God is different than he was 2,000 years ago. As if time makes any difference at all. Well, our society has grown a lot in time. You know, we just don't see things the way we used to before because we've learned so much and our societies have evolved so much. And now we don't see these issues the way we did 2,000 years ago. Yes, but God does. Because God is outside of time. You know, time has no impact on how God judges any situation because he has seen all of those things. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, as Hebrews 13:8 says, referring to Jesus Christ. Psalm 102, 25 through 27 says, "Of old you laid the foundation of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. But will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end." I know that if I go to God in prayer, I'm talking to the exact same God that spoke to Abraham, that spoke to Adam, that spoke to all these people before us. And I can understand that if God reacted in this way to them, he's going to react this way to me now. Nothing has changed. I haven't somehow evolved to the point where I no longer have the same needs and the same sins and the same shortcomings as those people did it back then. You know, the world's morality changes. It's amazing. I'm sure we all feel this way, especially those of us who are older, I should say. Being squarely in the middle of that bell curve myself, I still feel like I can say this, that, you know, if you told me 3 years ago that I could get banned from Twitter for saying that men are men and women are women, I would have thought you were crazy. And yet that's where we are today. Because our views on things have changed so dramatically. And can you imagine I can't even imagine what it's like for kids today, especially the younger kids, who are going to have to grow up with this idea that there is nothing that's certain. There's nothing that's true. There's nothing that's sure. Everything is up for debate. And there's no way that you can ever have anything to ground yourself into and say, this is true. Because we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a postmodern world where everything is up to debate. James 1:17-18 says that there is no shadow of turning with God. God does not change. God is certainty. God is an anchor, as we talk about. We have an anchor which keeps the soul steadfast and sure. And why is that from the standpoint of prayer? Well, why does that matter? Well, what it matters is that I know that an eternal God sees my life through an eternal view with eternal wisdom. It hasn't changed. God is not updating things as he goes along. God is not figuring things out. God does not have to learn more about me before he can make a good decision. 2 Timothy 2:11-13 talks about God being faithful. And he says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. And that's not saying that means that if I just go ahead and abandon God and do whatever I want, that means God is going to continue along with me and be faithful to me. The idea there, and we talked about this a few months ago, God is faithful to his nature, to his character, to his laws, to his decrees. He is who he is, and my changing doesn't change that at all. It doesn't make any difference how I decide to live my life. God is not going to look down on me and say, well, you know, people just aren't really going for this anymore. I need to go ahead and adjust myself. God remains faithful to his own character and his nature. But that's true also of my situation in life. Changes in my life do not dictate or do not reflect a change in God. If I'm going through a difficulty in my life, if I'm suffering in my life, and we talked to John 9 a couple weeks ago, you know, the first thing that the men, when they saw the blind man, asked Jesus when they saw him was, well, who sinned? And Jesus, of course, said neither this man nor his parents sinned. The point wasn't that because this person was sinning, this person was suffering because he was in sin. You know, we know that suffering comes from sin in the original sense. You know, that is the ultimate result of Adam's sin, that suffering has been brought into the world. And we have to deal with things now that we had to deal with before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because I'm undergoing something difficult in my life, because I am suffering, because I'm in pain, because I've been laid off, because I'm having family difficulties, because I'm being persecuted in some way or having some kind of difficulty in my life, that doesn't necessarily mean that God has turned away from me, that God has turned his back on me. And it's easy to think that, because when I'm praying to God, I may be suffering from some great illness. I may have suffered some sort of loss, and I'm trying to deal with it. And I pray to God, and I say, God, relieve me of this pain, and God does not do it, or at least he doesn't seem to. It's very easy for me to think, well, God isn't, I feel so distant from God. I feel separated from God. I feel removed from God because God has not removed that thorn in the flesh. You knew I would go to 2 Corinthians 12, right? Because that's what Paul asked, right? He goes to God and says, 3 times I prayed to God, remove this affliction from me. And God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you. It wasn't a statement on Paul's sin. It wasn't a statement of God not listening to Paul. It wasn't a reflection of God not caring about Paul. It was a reflection of God saying, you have what you need. And what you need is not for this to be removed. And that's a difficult thing for us to hear a lot of times. It's hard when we're going through temptation or difficulty or hardship or whatever it might be, and to hear God say, no, you're fine. That's exactly what he did. Psalm 22, verse 1. As David predicting the Messiah, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some people will go to that passage and they will take from that and say, well, see, Jesus is on the cross and God has now turned away from him. He's no longer, and I don't think at all that that's what's happening, because in the end of chapter 22, it becomes very clear in that psalm that God has not forsaken them. Just because you're suffering, just because you're in difficulty, does not mean that God has turned his back on you. What it means is that he is allowing you to go through this for whatever reason that he has, because as we already talked about, he's God, he's the creator. He has a wisdom that we don't have and we don't always see. It's important for us to remember that when he allows us to go through those things. Do we worry? Do we spend our time worrying and caring that God has not answered our prayers the way we want to? Do we see things in our life that needs to be better and we start worrying about those things? Do we start worrying again about the outcome of that prayer? I spend so much time focusing on getting something out of that prayer that I forget some other things as well. When Paul talks in Philippians 4:6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything through thanksgiving, let your prayers and requests be made known to God. And that's what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, wasn't he? When he talked about the idea that your Father knows that you have need of these things. Your Father, you may be suffering right now. It's not because God doesn't realize you're suffering. It's not because God has forgotten about you. It's not because God doesn't understand that that your life might be better in some ways from being relieved of these things. And it's important for us to remember, because what now happens is, I've got a choice. Well, I can quit praying about it. I can just give up. Or I can just assume that this is God's plan for me, it's never going to end. Or I can go try to find something and put my trust in somewhere else to answer my prayers if God won't do it. But ultimately what happens is I find myself continuing to worry about things after I prayed about them, because I'm focused on not getting the outcome that I want and not the outcome that God wants. And the question we have to ask, does my worry decrease as my prayers increase? Or is my worry based on whether or not my outcome is what I expected it to be? Do I continue to worry about something once I prayed to God about it? That's a hard question. And it's one that I remind myself of a lot. What you'll find a lot of times when I preach about things that I need to hear sometimes. And so I put myself over in that seat over there and say, what should I tell me? This is what I would tell me. You need to not worry about it when you prayed to God about it. And that's easier said than done. But that is something that prayer is supposed to teach us. It is designed to show us the idea of giving my cares, casting my cares on him as we read, because he cares about us. And knowing that just because God hasn't answered my prayer the way I want it to be answered doesn't mean that he doesn't care, and doesn't mean that he hasn't heard, and doesn't mean that he may already be working on it right now, and I just don't know. But it teaches us but that gives us some certainty, something that I can depend on in my life.